Yay! Okay, we're officially live.
Sweet.
Cool. So I figured since it would be a little bit awkward to do it back and forth to have people who were outside of my office to be the first ones to talk, and then we could just chat here as well. So it'd be a little less awkward. So we do intros and then talk from there. Sound good? Cool. So, hey everyone, thank you for joining us for the Harry Potter Alliance's Accio Books Rex After Dark. We are members of the research team for the HPA randomly. I'm Portia Patterson-Hurst. I'm the research team lead and racial justice researcher. We have Jessica Orinsky, who is our LGBTQ researcher. Megan, who is our climate change researcher, so many names, and Whitley, who is our gender equality researcher. And then join with us, we have guests today who are Marie from the New York Dumbledore's Army chapter. Sounds very straightforward. And Diana from Black Girls Create. So we're going to talk today about our recommendations from the Accio Books book recommendation list that we put out on Medium. I'm going to pull up that link and put it into the chat for anybody who wants to check that out. And whoever wants to be the first person to introduce themselves and work on their book list. Whitley, your microphone. Oh, I don't see. Okay. I didn't see your microphone off. So I was like, oh, she's ready.
I mean, yeah, sure. I can go first. That's fine. It's fine for me. Hi, hello. I am Whitley. I'm the gender equity researcher for the Harry Potter Alliance. So, of course, all of my book recs have badass women and badass non-binary folks. And all of these books, a lot of them tend to lean towards young adult, but there are some adult fantasy and fiction. And I double up as a librarian in my regular career. So obviously I love sharing books with people. All of these books are written by mostly women of color. And there is one book written by a non-binary author, one book written by a trans author, and one book written by a white man, but the way that he writes women is actually really great, and it's not cringy the way that some male authors tend to write. But anyway, here we go. So my first book that I recommend is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, and this book was my top read of 2018. We read it for our Friends of the Apparating Library book club last year. And if you look at the Medium link, I can even post that over in the comments directly. There we go. So if you look at that, I know there are so many content warnings, but despite all of that, it's such an incredible book. It focuses on Rin. She is an orphaned girl from the most impoverished province, and her journey to Signgard, an academy for all the children of warlords, her involvement in the next Poppy War, the third Poppy War. And it's just so good, and I highly, highly recommend it. And if you want something a little bit more lighthearted after reading something so heavy, I highly recommend The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. It's a novel told in verse about a second-generation Dominican-American slam poet. And Xiomara, the main character, is constantly questioning the gender roles in her life and in her culture. And then we love things with overlapping themes. And this one has a lot of themes of race and immigration as well. I'm just going to skip through some more books. Out of Salem, I read earlier this year, and I think it's one of my top reads of 2019. And the story follows Z, a zombie, who's just trying to live their life after the rest of their family dies in a car accident. And all of these old friends don't necessarily see them as changed or traumatized. They just think, well, why are you acting different? Why are you not going by your old name? I'm still going to call you by your old name. So there is some dead naming happening. but it's never really addressed or confronted because Z doesn't come out to anybody except for Aesel, a lesbian werewolf, and Tommy, a gender nonconforming half-fae, and they want to help Z find happiness and recovery. And Shreve is, Hal Shreve, the author, is non-binary, and I highly, highly recommend that one. And skipping forward a little bit more, the If I Was Your Girl by Meredith Russo is a story about a trans girl falling in love while hoping that she can still hold on to her own identity. I haven't read this one yet. I checked it out, but didn't have time to read it before it was due back to the library. But the author is trans, so all about some own voices stories. And wrapping it up with The Black Tides of Heaven by J.Y. Yang. They are so incredible on Twitter because they force me as an American to re-examine colonialism in a modern sense because they're from Singapore, so they're constantly incorporating like colonialism into their short stories, and it's all silk punk speculative fiction. And The Black Tides of Heaven is the first novella in a series, so quick reads.
Yeah, this one has really cool cover art.
Yes, it's so good.
I think it's so cool. And the one that with the zombies, I was like, I don't do zombies. But if I were to do zombies, perhaps.
This one, the zombie aspect of it is not even a big part of it. It's more like they just feel themselves sort of slowly falling apart. And it, honestly, the zombie aspect kind of resembles depression and PTSD more so than I'm going to eat brains. So
it's not really gory. So
right.
If you're not into horror hardcore, you could like read the book.
You can totally read it. Yeah.
That's really so much better for me. So have y'all read any of those?
I have not. The zombie one now I'm like, okay. Because at first I was like, that sounds cool, but I'll just have to hear about it. But
blood, gore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Zombies are like the one of like two things I just can't do. But that sounds like manageable.
Yeah.
I also read The Poet X, which I also really like. I read it because it did win the National Book Award for young people literature, whatever the subcategory is, which is always a great sign and well-deserved in this case. So yeah.
Yes, for sure. I read the book club and absolutely loved it. So
I read some of them. I have Poet X and Warcross, which you didn't mention, but I have it on my TBR list. And I have a really hard time moving things on the TBR list. I have a really great time just adding stuff to it.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, how do I prioritize some of the books that other people have recommended here as well? I don't know what to do with all the books on my TBR list. So if you're going to recommend one of them for me to push up furthest on my TBR list, which one would you say it would be?
I would say probably The Poet X because since it is told in verse, it's a very quick read. I think I managed to read it in roughly 36 hours. So it's really, really quick to read because you're not having to necessarily contain all the imagery that you might have to within Warcross, which is more sci-fi, but not too hard of sci-fi. It's like alternate universe, near future. Plus, Elizabeth Acevedo's newest book just came out like last week, I think. So
yeah, I've been reading that one, Girl on Fire.
Yeah, With the Fire on High.
On High, yes. And I got probably maybe halfway through, and I'm still working. I have so many books. Like I have so many books that I have reading right now.
She's from the Bronx. She's right from up here, so you know.
She's like,
I know. Get some New Yorker love in there. You know.
This weekend, I'm like, I thought she's gonna be there, and I feel bad because I haven't read any of her books all the way through. It's not a big problem, but it's a problem that I have. So yeah, thank you, Whitley.
Yeah, thank you.
A bit about how any of the books influence like your own social activism.
I think with both the Poppy War and Black Tides of Heaven, they sort of forced me to think about things outside of the United States, like to think about the impact of colonialism and mostly like just how it affects people who aren't white, you know?
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
And go to whoever wants to go next. Anyone want to go next? No? Yes.
I'll go.
Yay!
Hi everyone, I'm Jessica. I'm the LGBTQ researcher, as Portia said. And for my recommendation list, I decided to choose books that particularly I was inspired for my own personal activism in reading these books. So not only are they great representation for the LGBTQ community, but they've also inspired me in my own life and how I want to go about my activism and continue. And yeah, so I'll share a little bit about the books that I recommended. The first one that I recommend is The Pants Project by Kat Clark. It's about a young trans boy who is not out and not has not really begun any sort of transition yet, but is at a school that requires boys to wear pants and girls to wear skirts as part of the dress code, and is, you know, very upset about this, obviously, and feeling very uncomfortable wearing a skirt. And the character also has two moms, so it's kind of in the world of LGBTQ already without this character being out as trans. And the character it takes place in middle school, which I love about this book because the character hasn't really been exposed to a world of, you know, activism and social justice and too much discrimination apart from some, you know, not great family reactions that their grandparents have from their moms, but they still take the initiative to, you know, start a petition in their middle school that starts out with just a couple of signatures trying to get people to see what the big deal is about, you know, girls wearing pants and boys wearing skirts if they want to. And it turns into a big movement, and this character becomes kind of the mouthpiece of this movement without really going out to be an activist, but in their own experiences just becomes one. And I feel like for a lot of LGBTQ people, that's how a lot of activism starts, just because you find things that affect you personally and you get invested and want to make a difference and do something about it. So I really like this one, like I said, because it's a middle grade book. I love middle grade books, especially when it has to do with representation for the queer community, because a lot of times people think that you come into your queer identity when you're, you know, older, with high school, college age, but this is very clearly you can, you know, start at any age. So highly recommend that one. Another book that I recommend is a little different. It's a play. For anyone who has read, you know, Cursed Child and has experience reading a play, it's definitely different than reading a book. I'm sorry to make a comparison to Cursed Child. I know everyone's not cool with that. But, you know, it's out there. So it is a little different. But what I like about this play specifically is that it's mainly dialogue. There's not a lot of stage direction and action that you really need to follow. It's a true story. It's based on the story of Matthew Shepard, who I think it's now 20 years ago was killed in a hate crime in Wyoming, in Laramie, Wyoming. And this theater troupe decided to go back and interview people in the town, I think a year after it happened, and just basically tell the story of what happened in their perspective, and you know, how things are maybe changing, maybe not changing, and all of the different types of people who live in that town, because people have a very, you know, kind of one-sided perspective of small towns in the Midwest. So it sheds light on a lot of that, and also it's, I think, super. It stands the test of time, unfortunately, in a way, because there's a lot of the problems that they're talked about in the play are still relevant today. So that one I like because it's a different medium, and I've been fortunate enough to see a production of the show, which is also pretty cool. But even in reading the interviews and getting to know certain people from the town, you get to see a really honest portrayal of a true story, which is really cool. And these people exist in. There's been a foundation founded after Matthew Shepard that still exists and is still active today. So there's tons of ways to kind of draw into real life activism with that one as well. Another book that I recommend that I think is probably one of my favorite young adult LGBTQ books. It's called Juliet Takes a Breath by Gabby Rivera. It's about this young Puerto Rican queer girl from the Bronx, and she just recently came out to her parents, and they're like, or her mom, and they're not like, she's not super down with it. So, but she has been inspired by this book that she read about this like feminist writer that she kind of treats as like her Bible of like feminist theory and gender theory and all that stuff. She basically just writes to this author and is like, hey, do you need some help writing your next book? I'll do research for you. And she goes and moves to Portland for the summer to be an intern with this author, and is for the first time fully immersed in a queer world where people are talking about these topics that she's not used to talking about all the time, dealing with the relationship that, ended before she went away. So I think this one is an interesting perspective as well, because a lot of people think that just if you identify in a community that is that faces injustice, that you're automatically kind of like, you can be a mouthpiece for these sort of things. And a lot of times it's not the case. There's still a lot of things to learn along the way. You kind of have to hear a lot of different perspectives before you can figure out how you feel about a lot of things. And this book really navigates that so well, because it's a very vicarious read. You're learning along with the main character, Julia, and she honestly has no idea what's going on a lot of the time. And activism is really difficult, and you have to be willing to learn. And she definitely is, and that's something really cool I like about that one. And Gabby Rivera is just awesome. She's also a queer Puerto Rican lesbian from the Bronx, so that's great there as well.
Right from her soul. Like, here we go.
Mm-hmm, exactly. The last one that I recommend, which I had a lot of fun with, was A Day in the Life of Marlon Bundo, which a lot of people know through John Oliver. His show kind of was the impetus of this book, where Mike Pence, our vice president, has a family bunny and released a children's book about him. And Mike Pence is very well known for being anti-LGBT. So John Oliver and team, he's written it with Jill Twiss. They decided to come out with a book very similar, except instead this book, the bunny falls in love with another boy bunny, and they need to take on the evil stink bug that looks a lot like Mike Pence, which is just wonderful and fantastic. Similarly to the middle grade book, I love books for younger audiences that have very distinct representation. It's not like they're skirting around this like metaphor of, oh, this is what it's like to, for same-sex relationships and that sort of thing. It's very out there. Like, they're two boy bunnies, they're in love and they want to live their life, and they're facing some backlash, and they, get help from their community to deal with it. And it's very nice to think that, parents are out there reading this to their kids, even though it started as a silly joke to, get back at our administration. It's a really nice product of that. And I think that's such a creative way to be an activist, is to not only counter discrimination with something more positive, but to also use that positivity to tell a creative story and to teach some lessons to, you know, a younger generation. I love it. And it's nice because if you buy a copy, then they donate to both the Trevor Project, which is an LGBT crisis hotline, and I think an AIDS research organization as well. So in telling the story, they're doing good, and then also they're, you know, they're donating as well and doing good and making sure that work continues. So yeah, those are my recommendations.
Cool. So to be completely honest, I never heard of that last one at all. Like I didn't, because I watched John Oliver before, but then I guess I stopped watching it, and I was like, I saw Oliver on your like article, and I was like, what? John Oliver is writing children's stories? Like what's going on there? So it's really good to have that background that you just gave us on it. So I was like, I have no idea how any of this happened.
Yeah.
But it sounded like Marie was familiar with it whenever we like talked about it a little bit.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it was like a big thing in publishing because I work in publishing when this came out, and other books have come out since that kind of are like adult picture books almost. But this one is definitely a gem just because of the whole backstory.
That's the main reason why you've heard about it a lot in publishing is like the backstory of it, not really like.
Yeah, for sure.
So have you heard of any of these or read any of these before?
I have not, but I also am just getting back to like reading for real. So I'll probably be adding like a bunch of these to my list.
I love that you kept the list short, so I'm like, okay, I'll
It's
take
manageable.
like one or two. It's
Yeah.
really fine. Yeah, I can do fine. It's really helpful.
I remember when I bought the picture book, I was like, can I add this to my like reading list for the year? And I'm like, yeah, I read it. It's going on the list.
It counts.
So how did you feel about the books, Jessica? Like, was one of the books, like, did they have any like great impacts on how you like or change your perspective in any way, and why, if so?
Yeah, I think the one that's impacted me the most was Juliet Takes a Breath, I think, because I read it kind of when I was, I think I was just graduating college, and I was in that place where I had just really gotten into my activism in college. So I was at kind of the similar place where I was, you know, very secure with my identity and very secure with my role as an activist, but I still was learning where to put all of that energy. So I really related to the main character Juliet in that way. And I also really liked that the book wasn't it wasn't a guide on how to be an activist. It was more so because she encounters a lot of wrong ways to be an activist along the way, but it's more so a story about how to open your mind and stay open to different perspectives and listen to as many voices as possible before, you know, kind of making your decisions and letting that inform your activism, which is something that, you know, I'm continuing to learn all the time in the intersections of different types of activism that I am a part of, whether it's, you know, through the HPA or otherwise. But I definitely related to that story from Juliet in a lot of ways because I left college really excited and I had all of these, you know, people who I looked up to who I thought were like, had all of the answers in terms of, you know, where to put all of this energy. And then, you know, you keep learning and it just gets more and more complicated, but then you find a community of people who you want to continue learning with. And it's, you know, it's just, you continue on from there. So.
Cool. Sounds like a good journey for Juliet too. So I'm like, okay, that's one book I can probably put higher.
Yeah. I remember, I think 2 years ago, during Pride weekend in New York, Gabby Rivera was at an event at Housing Works, which is a bookstore in New York, and read the last couple of pages of the book. It was kind of like a culmination of Juliet's journey, and everyone in the bookstore was just kind of like jaw on the ground, like, this is beautiful. I don't even know what this book is about, but I'm so here for it. And like, I was with a couple friends and all of them were like, I'm buying that book tomorrow and I'm gonna go read it. So yeah, I might have to reread it just after this discussion, just because it's been a minute.
You know what's exciting about that book is that it was originally published by this small press, but Guile Press, which is a Penguin imprint, just kind of like rebought it. Essentially, is going to republish it in the fall, so it's going to probably show up on a lot of like best of lists all over.
Oh, that's so awesome. That makes me so happy.
You're a trendsetter.
It's so great.
Thanks. So Megan, do you want to go?
Sorry, I started talking before I realized that I hadn't unmuted my mic. Yes. So yeah, my books are about climate change. This is actually a very new position. I think I've been doing this actually about a month at the HPA, and I basically wanted to try to because climate change is such a huge scope. So what I really wanted to do is try to give people like background information, some context, also like different perspectives, some like different insights, and just overall like have something like more hopeful. Because I mean things are they can be pretty crazy, but we want to keep a positive mindset. Yeah. So for the first book that I have here that I really enjoyed is Radiant Sweetgrass. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Sorry in advance for all the names that I mispronounce. But it's by an Indigenous author who's also a professor of environmental and forest biology. So her perspective is really interesting because she basically takes these two lenses and looks at climate change through these two perspectives. So she talks about her background as well as like her professional understanding of what climate change is and what it means to be like a citizen of like the world, like as someone who's like basically here to give back and not just take from the earth. So she talks about her her upbringing and like the philosophy of her people, and it's a very interesting perspective. It's not like a super like popular perspective, and she kind of calls attention to the fact that like the West has kind of infantilized that perspective for a whole bunch of different reasons, but it's actually very refreshing to read something like this. And she basically just calls our attention to the possibilities of change, of the fact that like the way that we see the world isn't the only way that things can be. So that was a very like nice thing to see. It's very hopeful and thoughtful read. Which kind of leads into the second one, which is called "This Changes Everything: Capitalism versus the Climate" by Naomi Klein. And Portia knows this. I think probably Whitney knows this a little bit too. That capitalism is just the worst thing ever, and I really hate it a lot. So this was a really like not necessarily fun read, but like it just justified everything that I've always thought. So in that way, it was fun. This is another book that basically tries to change our perspective as well, because basically what the idea of climate change and like global warming and stuff is kind of being sold as like inevitable. Just like a thing that's going to happen to the earth because that's how the earth works, instead of us basically seeing the fact that a lot of it is driven by capitalism, by big corporations, because there's money to be made by destroying the earth. So basically this book points that out, and again asks us to like change our perspective, like see things through a different lens. The fact that like we don't have to be relying on these big corporations. We don't have to have our, let's say, food production the way that it is. We don't have to be throwing out all this food at the end of the day. We don't need all these giant farms. It's all profit, it's all capitalism, and that's what this book basically talks about, and the way that capitalism is basically the driving force behind all of the stuff that's happening. And leading into this next book as well, The Merchants of Doubt, which was, okay, so I didn't actually finish this one, but it also kind of has a similar theme, again, talking about like capitalism, and it shows sort of like the history behind why there's so much skepticism and like a weird understanding of climate change and the term global warming. It basically talks about the way that media and like the change in like education systems and stuff has led to this understanding. Like it was a purposeful change. Like people, corporations and stuff decided that they wanted to basically market and like sow these seeds of doubt into the science behind climate change, again, for profit. And this book basically describes and goes through the history of that. The next one is A Global Warming Primer by Jeffrey Bennett. This one is actually available online. It's not very long. It's a Q&A style type book. Basically, you know, you go through the different chapters, ask a question, and then it will give you the answer. It gives you a whole bunch of facts on climate change, and it's illustrated, and it talks about like the different, it'll give you history, different perspectives, and then like possible solutions. So it's really interesting if you want to just like go through it, like answer your climate change questions. It's basically pretty thorough. And the last one is just a fun read that I thought was really interesting. It's called Permafrost by Alistair Reynolds. And it's a time travel story. So the premise is basically the scientists, group of scientists, travel back in time from the year 2080 to 2028, basically to try and save the Earth from a climate change disaster. So I thought that was super interesting. You normally get books about living in the aftermath of like an apocalypse. So it's like trying to survive or something. There's nothing that can be done. There's like, or some like weird accident that's happened. But this one specifically wants to actually change the future so we don't live through this this disaster. And yeah, I thought it was really like a refreshing read. Again, it's very like hopeful and thoughtful. It's a very interesting take too on like time traveling, the way that it's done. It's I mean, it's not necessarily spoilery, a little bit spoilery to talk about how the time travel is done. But it's overall, like I said, just very like insightful. And it just also basically encourages you to look at things differently, think about things differently, and is a little bit of a cautionary tale about like where we could be headed to, though, like without the benefit of time travel. So yeah. Yeah, those are my recs.
Yeah, I saw the list and I saw this one, this Last of Permafrost on there, and it mentioned time travel. I'm like, that's right up Diana's alley.
I just added it to my thing, my list of things to buy. So it's on my book list already.
Yeah, so
Very excited.
How do you feel about climate change and time travel? Like,
Well,
what is
so
that?
I in high school I was in this like small, I guess they're called small schools, but like they like focused on like environmental justice. And then I like kind of got away from that because I ended up like going more into English and stuff in college. But that was something that I like grew up learning about and thinking about a lot. So it being a book in like sci-fi and time travel on top of that is like right up my alley. So I'm like very excited for this book.
Yeah, I'm curious about how we can be in the book, being a point where the world is like awful, but then also there's enough tech for you to do time travel.
Right.
like, what is that, like, weird convergence there? We're like, oh, like, we had a climate change disaster. What's working after a big climate change disaster, especially like 40 years later? And then, okay, somehow we're going to be able to like go back. Like that sounds really interesting. Like just navigating that, right? Like how in the world the tech is fine for that.
Right, and like which resources they have. But like, I feel like that's kind of some stuff now too, where like stuff is trash in some places, but like our technology is great.
Right, like we're hearing diseases and the diseases are coming back.
Right.
You know, like oh.
But like we can like live stream people in different places. So.
It all comes around.
Yeah.
How about you, Marie? Have you read any of these or heard any of them in your publishing life?
Oh gosh, I mean, there are definitely tons of global warming themed books, especially nonfiction right now. I feel like the major one that I've been hearing about is by David Wallace Wells. But these seem like they definitely.
What is that one, the David Wallace?
That one is. I can look up the title real quick. It's definitely kind of more on the side of like things are too late. Everything is really awful already. I guess in a way that just drives home why this isn't so important, but definitely doesn't have as much hope as, say, time traveling novels.
Yeah, I'm really grateful that you included these. Really cool, especially the one with the indigenous, like, her perspective of like the earth and what that means, and like how like people who they've been like worried about the earth forever, and then we're just now like Western movements are kind of like, oh, we should worry about that, but they've like Native people have been worried about the land the whole time, so it's been so great to like hear about the things that like colonialism has come in and just like changed, like even when it comes to gender and like how like transgender rights were different like than like other like communities before colonialism. It's like, oh, so like Western people just came in and just effed everything up, from the earth to how people identify themselves and live their lives. Like fantastic. Crap all over the place. And I think we're running a little slow, so I'm going to go right into mine. So that kind of brings me to one of my recommendations on my list, which is an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. It's like a 236 page book, so it's not like an in-depth history. It's not like a big like history book. I wish it were. I wish there was a way that we could have chapters on the perspective of things that we like read in high school for history for whatever reason from the perspective of Indigenous people. But unfortunately, there's only so much that people can compile together, and I'm really grateful for the author to be able to pull together what she could. They're going to do a version of this for young readers. I think it's currently on the advanced reading copies, like if they're available currently, and some copies, but they're coming out later this year with the one for young adults. I think it's formatted a bit differently, where it kind of looks like a history book. Like you can see like pictures and stuff like that, and it's kind of more interactive. So I definitely would recommend this book, but also that one, because I'm not lying, I like got through a good portion of this, but I didn't finish it. And I'm sure I have pictures, I'll do better. And I'll pick that up. And then while we're also on the topic of Indigenous, so Marie, when I was like looking through, I was trying to make sure I had like a good wide-ranging kind of idea of what racial justice looks like for different communities, and I was like really finding a hard time to like figure out like which Latinx book would like help me pull that out. And so I talked to Marie, and she told me about Sabrina and Corina, and it is a really good book on like short stories, and it's all from like the either perspective of Latinas who have indigenous backgrounds, or just like they're Latinas, and they're mostly set in the West. I know nothing about the West. I know California, and I know some geography about it, but everything's a little fuzzy because I'm from the South, and I know the South, and I know the Northeast, and the West is a little like weird out there. I'm like, is Kansas by New Mexico? I don't know. And so in this book, they're really good about like kind of having that out, and not only that, but like they took you to different time periods within the different short stories, and you could tell you were in the 90s, but it wasn't saying like you're in the 90s. It was just like, oh, like some of the things that you're saying here kind of make me feel like when I was growing up in the 90s, this is what's going on. So now I know that this teenager who is babysitting a sugar sack as her baby, like for a school project, that sounds like a 90s kind of project. And it was really fun seeing how that sugar baby and that teen girl's perspective of her family, you know, the things that were going on with her family versus this boy that was the father of her sugar baby for class, how he was like, how he and his friends had kind of found artifacts, and then an archaeologist like group came in and like started doing like a dig, and then it kind of like comes around from the perspective of the kids who are like either from like indigenous communities nearby or, you know, just in the area, and they all have their own kind of like relationship with the land, and a lot of the anger they have for different things kind of came out in like the ending of the short story where they just like throw away the sugar baby into the archaeological dig. And it was like, okay, so there's like a lot going on. There's like teen angst and like land angst and like identity angst, and there's like so many things. And I'm like, that sounds a lot like racial justice. Like there's so many different ways that all intersects, and we're all like, it all comes out in different ways. So I really appreciated that. And Sabrina and Karina. Other books. So then I also, like Jessica, I appreciate middle grade reads, but sometimes my middle grade reads tend to be like straddling the line of like, could it be YA? It kind of could. So the first one was Roll Offender, Hear My Cry, which I read so long ago. I was in middle school, I think, when I read it. And it's a series of books. I think I may have actually started with Let the Circle Be Unbroken, and then went back to Roll Offender, Hear My Cry, and then went into the other books that are tied to it, because one family, and you're with them in rural Mississippi, you're seeing how a family who was like a Black family went from like sharecropping to now owning land, and how the white people like nearby are interacting with that family, and how like some things that I never lived through. I've never lived through Jim Crow, but like this was very clearly like someone who knew the perspective enough to write about it in a very concise way. And even in the middle school, I could like, oh, okay, like it felt like the South to me, like it read true. And like now that I've spoken to older people, I'm like, okay, this like is a series that actually does ring true to like what happened in the South, and just like Jim Crow in general, because later on in the series they do an uncle in Ohio or something, and like the factory culture, and that's kind of like a really interesting thing as well, like how that led to people thinking that like, oh, there's still more opportunities outside of the South, but I'm like actually like you're still running into the same kind of stigma and like racism. So it's just a lot of like things going on there. And I think it also kind of stuck my wanderlust for getting out of the South. I just wanted to get out. I wanted to go try stuff out and not be there anymore, which is related to the other book, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. Which is, it's really cool. It's like a book that I would always want to do, of like talking to different people, interviewing them about their journeys, and then kind of pulling them together into one clear picture. So for this, she interviewed a person who went from the South to California, from the South to Chicago, and from the South to like, I think St. Louis or something, and just to like talk about their journeys and how they got there. And their stories sound a lot like stories I've heard from my friends who have family from like South Carolina that have lived in Philly for like decades now because they just migrated up north. And I had heard about like the Harlem Renaissance and other kind of like big period movements of African Americans like over in history, but like the Great Migration I never really had like a clear story for, and this is really great because it kind of gives you really good ideas of what happened, especially for just three people's perspectives. And What did I think of this one? Oh yeah, so I believe Shonda Rhimes picked up this book and optioned it, so it may become a series on Netflix. So may want to look out for that. It's really cool. I think she optioned it in like 2015, so maybe we'll get it. I think the other ones that I recommended are pretty. I'm going to go through fastly, quickly. Yeah. So the others are. I think just one more is Amina's Voice, which is a middle grade book, and it is really a great read. It made me like it was refreshing to like be in a middle school girl's head. She's like navigating like class. What's going on with my friend? Why aren't we talking anymore? That's weird. Like, am I good at this? I don't know. Like, she's being a middle school girl. But then she's also dealing with, she's living in Michigan. There's a large Muslim community where she's part of, her family is part of as well. And it's like natural things that like going to the mosque, it just feels like routine and it's like safe for her. But she's also like going through like the middle school like transition and then also going through transitions with the community surrounding them and her community at the mosque. And there's just so many different things that come to a head. But it all makes sense in this really nice middle grade way that like, it really was like, I feel like I would recommend that to like anyone who is like at a beginning level of like just understanding racial justice, especially like for Muslim Americans. That was like a really great pick. And then my final one was The Weight of Our Sky. I met this really cool writer who she's also works in publishing, so she knows all these different things. That's one thing I love about New York is how many people that work in publishing are here, because I'm just all like, oh, you know new books, let me know what's going on over there. And so for this one, she recommended The Weight of Our Sky. I never heard of, there was like, I forget what they named it. But basically there was this riot in the government of Malaysia in 1969, and it led to like a lot of people dying, and it was like just groups, like different groups they make up Malaysia, but like it was all different, like Chinese, Indian, and Malay, and they were all just like living together at first, and they were like seemed fine, but there's political pulls and ebbs, and then finally it all came to a head, and then this is what happened. And then the main character has OCD, and I think that this author is brilliant. Like people joke about having OCD, like not joke, but they're like, oh, you know, like I like can't help cleaning up, like I have OCD. And it's like, that's not necessarily what OCD is. And this author did a really great job of like showing how much OCD is like is part of your life. Like if you can't interact in life without having like go through a process. And it's really cool. Like so not only she's living through OCD, she's also living through like all of this turmoil and violence going around her, and it all just it's so much. So I felt bad when I read Whitley's list, and I was like, oh, she has all these trigger warnings, and I have none for this one book here. Hopefully nobody reads this without checking out like OCD. I should jump up to you, like don't read this unless you can like handle it. Because I could see that tripping someone up, but it's worth the read. Like it's very strong. And I like the character. She's also, I think she's 16, so she's pretty young, but she has a lot of the same struggles. I don't know, like mental health wise, like she's dealing with it, but she's also like very much under the brunt of it, and you have to like kind of ride that journey with her. So I really enjoyed that for this one, and that was my reading. So I know you said that you read Roll of Thunder like a long time ago.
At this point, I don't even know how to remember. Like, I'd have to reread it. It'd be like reading it all like for the first time at this point.
What about you? Any of those besides Sabrina and Karina?
Sabrina and Karina, yeah, that's definitely a good one if you like short stories, which is not 100% my thing, but it's good, if you want to read things piecemeal. And yeah, like you, I definitely read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry in like middle school. And yeah, definitely good classic.
Yeah, it feels like a primer. Like most people have read it, but then I don't want to assume that everyone's read it. So I just like, oh, maybe I'll just plan my book recommendations. Maybe someone's never picked it up before. So how about y'all? Like, I know that we're all been meeting off mute, but do y'all have any insights to each other's recommendations or anything else? Any questions?
I have a question. So Portia, you mentioned that book that you read that one first and then you went back and read other ones. Is it like a series that you should read in order, or is it just kind of like they're all related to each other, or I'm not familiar.
They're mostly just related to each other.
Okay.
I think the first one chronologically, so the author, I think she started the series probably thinking that she was going to do like maybe 1 or 2 books. It wasn't going to be like a series in her brain. And then she came back to it and was like, I'm going to actually flesh this out. So she had like 2 books, and then she went, I'm going to go way ahead. And so she went way ahead. And then she came back and then did books behind. And so it's just a lot. And she kind of based it on her own family's history, which is pretty cool. So she like knows what she's talking about, but it's also fictionalized to an extent. So it's pretty like good. So like the first one chronologically is about the land that the family ends up owning later, but at the time it's like plantation land. So it just depends which one you want to start with. I just picked Roll of Thunder because I feel like most people know that one, and it's kind of like an easy gateway into like figuring out the others.
Very cool.
Anyone else have insights on any others? I was going to talk about Laramie. Can you talk a bit more about Matthew Shepard's story?
Yeah. So it was in the 90s. The story gets a little like intense, but on the basic level, he was at a bar and these 2 guys claimed that he hit on them or made a pass at them, and when he was on his way home, they basically attacked him and tied him to a fence, and he ended up dying. And it was the impetus of this conversation nationally about hate crimes and the gay panic defense and all of that sort of legislation and whatnot. And that's still something that exists today. But basically that was, there were like court cases about it. And I don't want to like I said, get too into it, but yeah, it's just it started as this like national discussion about how gay panic should not be a viable defense in that sort of case, and what constitutes a hate crime, and all that kind of more nitty-gritty detail stuff. But there were a lot of people. I remember specifically about reading the play is that it was an interesting perspective on the being in Wyoming, and people a lot of the time think, oh, if you live somewhere where they're not accepting of you, then you should just move. And first of all, it's not like possible for a lot of people, but also just the fact that people should not be forced to leave their homes for that reason. They should be able to live where they want. And a lot of people really like the town, regardless of maybe some of the people who live there who don't, have aren't as, evolved as other people. So yeah, it's an ongoing conversation. And they just recently, I think it was last year, he's like official like resting place is in this like national building, and I don't know the details. I'll link to an article. I put it in one of my reports last year when it came out, but it was like marking the 20 years since he died, and he's finally getting like a final resting place in a national building in Washington, I think. So it was a big kind of moment for everyone to remember that the conversation is still happening. And, it's kind of saying, don't forget that this happened, because we still need to talk about it. And a lot of these things are, continuing to happen across, it's specifically the United States, but obviously elsewhere too.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I remember hearing about the Matthew Shepard story while I was in Tennessee. So like in high school probably, and it was like then I think it was very much like it was like just like I noticed like this thing happened, but it was like a news thing, and it maybe there was like a 5-year anniversary or something like that where it just like was topical, but I never like knew that they like optioned it into like, well, there's a play, but it makes sense. I feel like they probably tour schools and like do the play. It would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's a big piece. I know like a lot of colleges will do it, and both Matthew Shepard's parents have become these really involved activists after this happened. They started this foundation. I think it's just called the Matthew Shepard Foundation, and they go to they're now like public speakers on behalf of social justice in this sense, and they're super involved activists, which is pretty amazing because their story is very interwoven in the play as well, and it's very difficult, obviously, as like anyone could imagine, but it takes like an interesting twist that people may not see coming. They're very very nice people, but yeah, they've been doing a lot of great work as well.
And Megan, you mentioned the book Braiding Sweetgrass, like how that one has like like a different identity, like a racial identity tied to it as well as just like climate. Did you have any other books that you were thinking about recommending that have like different intersectional approaches to climate change, or was that like a standout one amongst the ones that you know of?
I wish I knew more. That was it stood out purposely because it had a different perspective. The indigenous aspect of it was really awesome to me. But yeah, I want to like purposely seek out like other like cultural or racial lenses and stuff to view this from, because I think it's really important to get like different insight, because we're not all Western. Right. So it's like important to bring that into it.
So between Robin, Subayana, and it was like Robin Subayana and Marie, do y'all have any like books that y'all like based on the different subjects that are covered here that y'all would recommend that weren't discussed here?
So I have one that I read. I read last summer. Anger is a Gift by Marcus Shero. It's one I read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. It's like my main kind of thing. But like Mark is a friend, so I was like, I'm gonna read it, support. Yeah, it's important. Also, it's set in Oakland, which is where I'm from. So for me, it was really great to read it, and I've read a lot of books where it's people the setting is really vibrant. So even if I've never been to that place, I can see it and all that kind of stuff. But it was really surreal for me to read his book and know exactly where everything was, and he's right around the corner from my grandmother's house and all these kind of things. But just the story is kind of around dealing with the main character is dealing with police brutality and the criminalization of students at his school. And so for me, it was really powerful in that it kind of shows how, because I think a lot of people don't really some people do have this thing where they're okay, I'm gonna become an activist, right? But a lot of times you kind of fall into it, or there's these injustices that kind of keep happening, and it's so much that you can't ignore it. And so that's kind of more what this book kind of does, is where you see this kid who should just be living his life, having to kind of step into this role that he doesn't necessarily want, but also it's I don't know any, it's one of those where you're who else will do it if I don't. And so yeah, so it just really stuck with me.
I was in the Strand this past weekend, and it came out in paperback, and I just bought it. So that's why it's right on my desk.
I keep hearing about that one, and I'm just like, when again? My TBR pal.
I know, right? Yeah.
All right. How about you?
For me, it's always hard to give book recommendations because I'm always reading like several seasons ahead for publishing because Lord knows I don't have time to read outside of work reading. But I think out of the ones that have published and that also kind of fall into these categories, I really like Jacob Tobia's Sissy. It's a book of essays, basically a memoir about their coming out as being non-binary. And they do it in a way that's really accessible and really like, you know, full of joy, you know, so it's not the kind of story that's going to be very emotionally draining, though of course there are a lot of difficult moments. But I do always like those stories that like have really good, smart representation, but also won't like punch you in the face with like, ouch, that was a hard story to read kind of thing. Looking forward, I'm really looking forward to reading David Yoon's Frankly in Love, which is a YA romance about a Korean American boy who falls in love with a white girl, which is definitely not allowed in his family. And David Yoon is actually the husband of Nicola Yoon, also a YA author. So like definitely a power couple there to watch for. This wasn't really a category here, but just in the category of like feminism and things like that, I have been recommending The Falconer by Dana Zapnick for like anybody who will listen to me. It came out earlier this year, and it's a coming of age story set in 1990s New York City, about this girl who's figuring out what it means to be a feminist, what it means to be a woman and an artist, and it's just really, really well written and definitely not like heavy message or anything like that, but like just a really great story that I think I would always want to recommend.
Just a general everyone read. Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad we had such different like people and different perspectives to add here today. Like we have Whitley, who's a librarian, and you're a publisher, so you have like mounds of books that you just like have in your head at all times, and just like pull out. And then like Jessica, like just whittled her list down so nicely, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I could do that. I could do one of these. I could get it done. And then in climate change, like I didn't even think of like having a web format book, like one that's just like easy to pick up. I'm like, oh, I should have done that. And so I'm so grateful for Megan for just like, this is easily accessible, just pick it up. And then so I'm really grateful that we had this discussion today and are able to like think through these different topics. As always, these are like evergreen. Our lists are going to be up on Medium as long as Medium exists. So if you want to stop and check them out, we have the link in the description for this video. And you can also check out the HPA website whenever, I keep saying HPA, the Harry Potter Alliance website whenever you want. And yeah, so thank you for being here today. Do people want to like sign off with like their social media apps if they want to have their social media open to people to hit them up for recommendations or to talk a bit more about what we discussed today? I'm going to start with y'all.
I'll just throw out there, I like Goodreads is a great way to share recommendations of books, and my name on there is just my name, Jessica Rosicki. And yeah, I do a lot of reviews, and a lot of folks from the Harry Potter Alliance are also on there as well. So we could get a lot of good recommendations on there.
Thanks.
Okay, I guess I'll go. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at MALLETGRRRL. I keep losing track of how many R's there are. College was a weird time. But yeah, I tweet about book stuff on there a whole lot. Yeah, you can hit me up there. And on Goodreads.
You can go, Megan. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I was just taking a second to look up the Twitter handle because I wanted to recommend actually the because I also co-manage the Uprighting Library Book Club. So you can follow us there, and you'll get a lot of our book recs as well. And our handle is Fotal Book Club, so it's FOTAL Book Club. And that's on Twitter, and you can find us on Facebook at Friends of the Uprighting Library Book Club as well.
My turn. So you can follow me at Yana_Hallows. This is definitely Hallows. But you can follow Black Girls Create, which is where we do a lot of like nerd, fandom, creative stuff at We Black and Nerds on Twitter.
And the chapter that I'm the chapter organizer for, which is New York Dumbledore's Army. We're really active on Facebook if you just look up New York Dumbledore's Army. And then on Instagram and Twitter, we are HPANYDA.
Cool. And I'm Portia, PORSHA _ OBBI on Twitter. Sometimes I have book recs. Sometimes I post them on the We Black and Nerd site. Sometimes I have them for the Harry Potter lines. I read sometimes, but my TBR list is so big. So yeah, I'm around. I'll read something. I feel bad because I feel like Goodreads would probably be the best place, but I have no discipline and I can't do it. It just it's overwhelming. So here I am. So you can catch any of us at our Twitter handles that we gave to you, and thank you for stopping by and checking out this video today. And thank you all for joining us, making this the whole thing. I'm so happy that you could join it and we can make this happen. All right, I'm gonna stop the broadcast now.
Bye.